What's going on, guys? It's your boy Beats by Ash, back at it again with another banger of a video. And today, I'm going to be bringing you guys my complete OPO2 Paramount War competitive metagame tier list. And what I mean by competitive is the way we're going to be approaching these evaluations is based on looking at attending a premier level Bandai event. And you may be asking what meets those qualifications of this event. So what that's going to require is the event is going to need to be 7 rounds or more and be sanctioned by Bandai. So I'm talking about in-person regionals, in-person treasure cups, online regionals, and online treasure cups. We have a complete different approach for decks that are going to be viable in your local metagame, and I want to differentiate those right off the bat. On top of that, I want to mention that I'm going to have my tier list appear on the screen immediately with all of the placings intact of what it will look like after we're filling it out. Now, I'm doing this for a couple reasons. Lots of people, not even just in the One Piece community, when they fill out a tier list in a video or a stream, they typically like to already have their placings at the bottom, and then they move them onto where they feel like they should be as the video progresses. And the reason I'm not doing this is so I can appeal to all of the Ninja Watchers, all the people who just want to screenshot deck lists and net deck, and get those people out of here right away, because I'm going to be giving out a ton of free value, and I only want to be helping out the people that actually care about bringing their all-time best. Because what I always say is, invest in the best and you will be blessed. And I'm the best, so prepare to be blessed. So in this video, I'm going to be giving away 1 copy of every Tournament Pack 1 card. So the way you are going to enter this giveaway is very simple. Number 1, be subscribed to the channel. On top of that, guys, almost 60% of you are not subscribed. I'm giving out way too much value for you not to be clicking the button. So make sure to support your boy, because no one's out here doing it like me. Number 2, like the damn video. Number 3, comment down below what your favorite aspect of the game in the OPO2 meta has been compared to OPO1. And if this is your first time starting, just explain to me what your favorite strategy has been to pilot so far. Before the next video, I'm going to pick 1 random person who entered the giveaway, but right now I'm on my grind set, so the more I win, the more I give back to you guys. A long time ago, my boy Peter, he gave us a couple starter decks, and I bought a couple starter decks. I was supposed to have an online tournament on the simulator, but I got super busy, and I've decided that is going to be a Discord only tournament. So if you want to be a part of that, whenever I announce it, make sure that you're in the Discord and you will get a notification about that. But besides that, we're going to go ahead and get into the goo. Let's go, boys. So starting off, like I said, all the Ninja Watchers are gone. All the people who just want a net deck are gone because you've had the picture up there the whole time. I'm going to go ahead and just go through the tiers with you guys, quickly define what each of those mean, and go through the iterative process that we're going to approach this session. So first off, in Tier 1. Tier 1 is what I classify the most consistent decks for premier level events, and these are also decks that have very few weaknesses, i.e. these decks can draw hands where it doesn't really matter all too much what you open. You have a fair chance to play the game, and that sets them above the curve from the other decks, and you are typically going to see multiple of these decks in your tournament experience. Now, decks in Tier 1 are also going to be decks that I'm going to expect there to be multiple players piloting this strategy within the top 16, within the top 8, and they have a very strong chance to win the entire event. Because the way I approach these big level events is not just to top, but to win. And as you saw in my previous video about breaking down the structure of these premier level events, there's a very different approach than what we want to do if we were going to our own locals. And that's where this video is going to go hand in hand. So if you don't understand all of the structures involved with those high-level events, make sure to go check that out. Now, decks that are in tier 1.5 are decks that I think you still have a decent chance of winning the tournament, but I will say you have to be a bit luckier to make it to the finals with these strategies, just because they may not be as objectively as consistent as these other strategies that are in the tier 1 category when it comes to playing 8 or more rounds. Because when you're in a 4-round tournament, something that relies on, one specific card, is fair to say that that's a good choice, because you're only going to be in a 4-round tournament, so you only have to open that card, a small amount of games, whereas in a big event, you have to open that card, such as, Onigashima or the Moby Dick, 8+ times to win, and your entire strategy is based on that. And so that's why I put these decks in tier 1.5, and as well, these decks also may have like one deck that kind of hard counters them, and or they also may have a bad mirror match. Because you guys have to take into context, if you were expecting a lot of one deck, and there's not that many cards in the game to differentiate your deck from someone else's in the mirror match, there's going to be quite a few RNG factors, and for that reason, you may not be able to bypass that gap of getting top 16 to getting to the finals without a little bit of luck. And for that reason, I have these classified in this tier. That by no means does not say these are not viable in the current metagame. You could argue they are even equally as viable, but you're trading power in exchange for consistency, and that's something you have to consider. Also, we go off of these evaluations by overall card quality. Now, in the tier 2 category, these decks are ones that I think are a little bit more inconsistent or have a niche stance in the metagame. Now, what I mean by that is, in the metagame, each tournament is different than the last, even though we're still using the same card pool. A good example of this would be, at the very beginning of this format, I feel like blue was not nearly as good as it has progressed in the metagame to be, and that is based off of pure analytics of what we have seen representation is in the middle of the format, where less people started playing green and more people started playing Whitebeard, which is a bigger advantage in terms of matchups for the blue strategy. And I think this is a good way to define these decks, because in a certain tournament, the blue deck could be argued to be tier 1 based off of representation and what you expect. But in general, the way I'm placing these is how the metagame has shaped out to be, and it's based off of percentages and analytics. One other thing I want to touch on is the information I'm about to give you is purely objective. Now, I see a lot of content creators coming out with content, coming out with deck profiles, or any type of strategy that they're promoting, because they just want to come out with things. Now, as you'll notice on this channel, I am mostly striving to do 1 long form videos per week, and I'm not trying to spam content. And that is because I am strictly here to add value to people in a way where they are going to be able to bring out their all-time best. Now, that may not be the best strategy for my overall channel growth, but what I don't want to do is be putting out deck lists where someone says, putting out a deck list and putting out a strategy where I promoted it and said, this is insane, and then I run the same leader at an upcoming tournament, but I change the deck incredibly, or I just use a different leader. Because in my opinion, that's very misleading, and a lot of people do that just to output content because they're trying to gain viewership and maintain that consistency. The reality is, there's not as much content you can do in terms of promoting individual unique strategies over the course of a meta at the current standpoint because of how limited the card pool is and how limited the viable decks are. So I have no disrespect for anyone who's doing that, but I just want you guys to know that if I tell you something is a strong deck, or I think this is the best choice to bring at this time, I truly mean it, and I am not telling you guys something that I would do behind your back. And that's why for a while I withheld my blue deck list that I won with at that case tournament, because I was playing in multiple tournaments after that, and I actually planned on using the same deck list or changing it by one card in multiple events going forward. So I didn't want to give that out to you guys because I would be using the same deck list. And a lot of people might not agree with that, but I would be giving up my competitive edge, and I didn't want to just put out another blue deck list that I didn't feel was optimal, because at the time, and still to this day, I feel like the list that I crafted at that tournament was the best strategy to go forward with the Doflamingo deck. And I'm not going to sit out here baiting you saying you should play all these cards and then just swap deck lists. Like, that's ridiculous. You guys need to know that I am transparent and I am here to bring the best out from a competitive standpoint. Sorry to go on for so long, but I felt like that needed to be said because there are some people out here who are doing that, and I think it really differentiates myself from the community and what I'm willing to do for your guys. So that's why I revealed my deck list in my online regional last week, because now I'm switching to a different deck and I feel comfortable giving you guys the most optimal line of giving you guys the most optimal strategy with that deck going forward. Now, without wasting any more time, and one last thing I want to mention in terms of how I'm structuring this tier list, you may notice right away that I'm not including every single deck that is possible to play right now in the current game, because I want this to be concise, and all of the decks I'm listing are decks that you should feel comfortable playing at a large event. I'm not going to sit here and talk about decks that I don't think you have an honest chance at winning the entire thing. That's why this is the competitive tier list. I don't need to sit here and tell you why you should not play Purple Shanks. You guys should know that by now, and I want this to be a video where new people can come in and they can only afford one deck, and they can make a educated decision on what they want to invest in so that they have the best chance to start out competing at a fair playing field. And that's something that I wish people did for me, but I started out with Blue Purple Croc, so it obviously wasn't the case at the time. Now, I would like to dedicate this video to my friends Alex and Cyrus, aka Cy the Sports Guy. He is my friend that I do the podcast with on the Untouched Value channel. And they're joining the game just now, so I want them to be able to look at this video and see these are all the potentially viable decks I can choose from. So if they want to invest in a deck of their own, that they know how to make the best decision for them. Because a lot of new people get misconstrued about what is actually going to give them the best chance at starting out at a competitive level, and that's where I'm here to help you guys out. So I'm going to start off in the tier 1 category, and I'm just going to go down from there, and we're going to go by each deck, and I'm going to explain the advantages, the disadvantages, and also I'm going to explain what stance this is best in for the current meta. In order to give you guys this content in the most effective ways possible, I'm going to go over the current meta landscape. The most represented strategies you can expect to see at these tournaments are number 1, Zoro, Whitebeard, and Law. I would say those are the most played strategies, and you should be able to reasonably expect to see 2 or more of those decks, and should not be surprised if you do see more. In my last tournament, I saw 4 Law, 3 Whitebeard, 1 Zoro, 1 round 1 Garp. And now the second decks, the other couple decks you might expect is Kinemon / Kid and Doflamingo. I think you can all reasonably expect that you shouldn't be surprised if you see one of these pilots in your tournament run. And now this is very interesting to see because at the beginning of the meta, we saw that green was very highly played. And for whatever reason, players are deciding to move away from these mono green strategies, which makes a very interesting metagame landscape. So starting off in the tier 1, these decks are in no particular order. We're going to talk about Zoro. Now, what makes Zoro so good? The best thing about this leader and why red is so overly represented is that you have access to 2 searchers. Now, these searchers are in the form of Nami and Curly to Dan. When you look at the One Piece card game and you have experience from other games, it's very easy to tell that consistency is very hard to come by. And this is because when you look at the decks that are considered the most consistent, i.e. the ones with 2 searchers, these searchers don't even directly add a card from deck to hand. It's actually a percentage-based chance for you to add a card from deck to hand. But when you do so and it succeeds, this gives you a +1 in card advantage. That means that you played a card that then generated another card for free. And if you're familiar with card game economics, this is one of the highest valuations in terms of what you're trying to gain in a competitive card game. Now, this can add up very quickly when you think about the fact that Curly to Dan is the first searcher ever released that can add you a different searcher off of its effect. And the fact that they have 2 of these in the deck is insane. But when you think about what Curly to Dan does, I think it's one of the most high value cards in the current game, and I honestly think it's unfair in certain circumstances. If you play Curly to Dan and add Nami, and then you play Nami and add a Straw Hat Crew card, you're getting a +2 in terms of card advantage and developing 2 bodies with only 3 Dawn. And this is even better in the Zoro deck because these low power bodies are essentially a low investment in order to make a natural attacker. A natural attacker is what I call anything with 5 power that can essentially hit the other person's leader with no investment. So when you have these cards in the Zoro deck and you're effectively attaching 1 Dawn to your leader every turn, you're making it to where you have a very low investment to create a natural attacker because now you only have to invest 1 Dawn to make your Curly to Dan 5k, and if you have a Nami, you can use other cards like Makino and Magura, which make that a natural attacker by investing only 1 Dawn. So these cards have a higher appreciating value in the Zoro deck specifically. Now you may be asking, what makes having these 2 searchers in your deck better than having what I would consider infinite value searchers in the form of a mono green deck? And in my opinion, that is because in the Zoro deck, I think it is the best representation of a candidate that makes it to where if you open any number of cards, if you open any variety of cards, you don't specifically have to see these searchers, you can accomplish the same general game plan that you set out to complete. Now, that is because in the Zoro deck, for whatever reason, they just made it to where your Zoro leader, it doesn't have to just boost Straw Hats. You can literally just boost all your characters, so it gains the most value of these low-cost characters that are already high-value cards over any other leader in the game. And I think that that makes it probably the most consistent deck to run in a 8-round tournament, because you got to think, half of the time, since the game is not currently that consistent, you can lose to yourself. And I think in the Zoro deck, it is quite more difficult to lose to yourself than it is in other strategies, such as maybe a Law deck where you have to access a searcher plus a payoff, or in the Whitebeard deck, if you're playing stage, you're looking for a specific card. And while you do draw 2 cards per turn, the chances of you bricking what I consider not being able to play the game are higher in these other strategies than Zoro. Because it doesn't matter what cards you open, you still have a chance to win that game in terms of expressing skill and differentiating yourself from the other player. Now, on top of this, we also have to take into consideration that Red currently has the most outstanding card quality of any other color in the current game. The fact that the Zoro leader has synergy with all these cards is honestly absurd. When we look at another color like blue, blue has no direct removal. There is no way to play something that destroys something. And on top of that, all of the red cards that remove stuff just do it on play for whatever reason. When we look at the Zoro deck or the Luffy deck, any type of mono red deck, you have 4 Vista, 4 Nico Robin, 4 Mass Deuce if you choose so, 4 Edward Newgate, and then you have 4 Jet Pistol, which means if you want to max out on those, that's 20 direct removal cards. Cards that KO something. And my friend Kyle brought up a very good point about this. 1-for-1 value trades are extremely powerful in this game. And once he said that, that put off a trigger in my mind. That is so true. Gum Gum Jet Pistol is arguably the best removal in the current game, and it's super Dawn efficient. You can pay 4 Dawn and potentially remove something that's 6 cost on its own, potentially remove something that's higher than that with all the modifiers you have in the deck. And I think a big power spike for these mono red decks that no one considered going into OPO2 is the fact that in set 1, I really thought that Gordon was one of the most insane cards because it allowed you to combo with your pistol, your Nico Robin, all these removal effects for a very low investment. And I think going forward, the biggest advantage of red, on top of the fact that your Curly to Dan gets you access to Nami, a card that allows you to access the best type in the game, Straw Hat Crew, you can also search Gordon. And Gordon just gives you another layer of removal in conjunction with the pistol. If you use a Gordon on a Dracul Mihawk, and then you play a Gum Gum Jet Pistol, you just remove something from the board that costed 9 for a total of 5 Dawn. And on top of the fact that the Zoro leader extracts so much value from the board and so much value from displaying Dawn efficiency, this just adds even a higher evaluation to these modifiers in the deck. And with 4 Gordon, 4 Makino, 4 Nami, and with 4 Gordon, 4 Makino, 4 Nami, and 4 Otama, that right there is 16 total 1-drop red characters, which means if you play your Dadan on turn 1 and have no 1-drops in hand, then in a vacuum, you have an 85% chance to reveal one of those cards. And that is really good, because if you can hit that consistently, you're going to win the game. I've already noted these are some of the most powerful cards, and at the same time, there is an added layer to skill in the aggro v aggro matchup when deciding your Dawn efficiency. And a big point of this game that a lot of people don't recognize is anyone can beat anyone. In order to perform well, you have to have this mindset. And a lot of people disregard this. But on top of that, once you get into this mindset, you can easily see that if you maximize your Dawn efficiency, you are going to win more games overall with the Zoro deck than other strategies where you have less skill expression, because it allows you to win some games where you really shouldn't be favored to win. And that's where the high reps and the high amount of practice and work you put in can really benefit you. Now, a lot of players will disregard this because they just think, oh yeah, Zoro is easy. You just put a rush guy on board and hit the face. Well, I would agree with that in in the control matchups or the mid-range matchups, but when you're going against another mono red player, there's a lot of skill expression in terms of how you can play efficiently, and winning more games over time rather than just topping one tournament is what's going to differentiate yourselves as a skilled player, because this is a best of one game and it's a limited card pool, so you can't differentiate your deck that much. And I want to move on to other decks, but this is my entire synopsis as to why this is the bad deck. And this is my entire synopsis to why this is the current most consistent strategy to play in an 8-round event. High card quality plus consistency plus the ability to run large bombs such as 9-drop Edward Newgate, which I currently think is the best card in the entire game, just put this deck over the top in terms of what value it brings to the tournament, and it doesn't really matter what kind of meta you're expecting. The card quality is so high, and the bad matchups are not that bad, to where this is a very strong choice no matter what you are meta calling. So now moving on, I'm going to touch on Luffy just for a little bit. It's kind of similar, but there are a little bit of differences. So the main difference between Luffy and Zoro is while Zoro and Luffy are both mid-range based, the entire strategy of Luffy is that you are looking to remove high-value threats from their board, and you are able to play more flexibly. What I mean by that is you have a higher advantage in the Whitebeard matchup, which is a disadvantage for the in terms of matchups for the Zoro deck. And since the Whitebeard deck is super popular right now, I personally think that Luffy is the best choice to bring unless things change in the current metagame. That is because every single turn, you essentially get a free Dawn, whereas in Zoro, you are required to allocate one Dawn, which lessens your ability to play higher value cards. And that also gives us a larger advantage in terms of playing cards such as 5-drop Rush Luffy. This card requires a 2 Dawn investment to utilize the ability, and since we're getting a free Dawn every turn via our leader, it means that we can make that ability active on some turns where the Zoro deck would not be able to. Now on the other side of this, when you look at the Whitebeard deck, you can attack for 6 every turn, and you get to tax your opponent. But when you're playing Luffy, you essentially get to make your leader 6k every turn if you choose so, without allocating a Dawn, so you're basically avoiding taxes, and that's really good. You know, you think about this, and you realize the entire point of Whitebeard is to tax the other guy, and then you think about it in terms of the Luffy player, you're getting to use the same value out of your leader as their leader in a different context, but you don't have to lose a life every turn. And that also adds more value to your 9-drop character, which I already stated is the most powerful card in the game. And whenever I mean this, whenever I say this, I mean that in the red Luffy deck, the 9-drop is actually the best card in your deck, and it's the best card in every mono red deck, but you get the most value out of it in this strategy. That's because this is the only deck where if you already established a 9-drop character on the previous turn, if you play it on the following turn back to back, you're going to be able to attach your 10th Dawn to the first Edward Newgate. Then you can use leader ability, attach the second one, which means you have that on-attack ability active on the same turn you played a second one. And that is a big differentiator in these mono red matchups, because as we all know, having back-to-back Whitebeard on curve can be extremely oppressive and swings the tempo of the game in favor of that player. On top of this, you probably heard me speak about this in another video, but whenever we're talking about these meta decks, if I'm going to play a tier 1 strategy that's super popular, I want to be able to make sure I can differentiate my deck list from the other person in a mirror match to where I can gain a competitive advantage. And I think that's difficult to do with mono red in general, because the card quality is so far and few between. You get into a state where you're like, okay, I want 4 Nami, 4 Dadan, 4 Zoro, 4 4 Otama, and that takes up like 90% of your deck. So in the Zoro mirror match, it's difficult to change a bunch of cards to play into whatever you're meta calling. In the Luffy deck, you have more options to do that. Like, you can afford to play Gum Gum Red Hawk, which is arguably the best event to have versus Law, extremely good versus Green, and it allows you to gain value in the Zoro matchup too. So if you're expecting those decks, then you can play that card more easily than in the Zoro deck, because instead of having to allocate 1 Dawn every turn, you're getting a free Dawn, which means you have a higher chance of being able to leave up 2 Dawn for your Red Hawk. And that is a very important aspect of choosing what deck I want to bring to a big event, because I really like to not net deck and bring out strategies that people don't expect. On top of that, while you cannot afford to run the same amount of 1-drops as Zoro, you can still play your 16 and get that 85% chance to hit with a Dedan search. So you have a high number, you still have a high number of cards that are really valuable to add off of your Dedan. And also, the biggest differentiator for me of playing Luffy over Zoro is you have a better chance of winning going second. If you've been paying attention to the metagame, then you know that in the red v red matchup, whoever goes first is highly favored, and there are certain RNG factors that put that person in the driver's seat from the beginning to the end if they curve out correctly. Number 1, if you open a Nico Robin on curve and the other guy does not have a jet pistol on the following turn, you almost just blow the other guy out. Number 2, we're in a race-based meta, which means that blockers are not very high value because everyone's always just going to be hitting face and killing your low-value blocker with a Vista effect, which red notably has 5 of those. And on top of that, we can play Mass Deuce, which gives us a higher chance to win going second than a Zoro v Zoro, where the person going second is easily extremely unfavored. And when you play Mass Deuce on turn 1 in response to the Zoro player's turn 1, you effectively are putting out a Nico Robin before they can do so if you have a modifier. And that card was highly disregarded at the beginning of the meta because people are like, it's worse than Beppo, it only kills something with 2k power, and it requires a 2-Dawn investment. Like I stated before, in the Luffy strategy, you don't have to invest 1 per turn, you get a free 1, which adds more value to these Dawn 1x, Dawn 2x effects in our deck. And I think that's very important because that card is also a 2k, so you don't lose any value in the matchups where it is not applicable. But in the matchups where you have a large disadvantage going second, you can actually overcome some of those RNG disadvantages, and it gives you a higher chance to win games that you should have no interest in winning. And there's many other implications for going second in that regard. But ultimately, whoever goes first has Nico Robin on curve and has Whitebeard on curve, is in the driver's seat, and it's hard to put them out of that position. So that makes Luffy a super viable choice. Also, Luffy is just built to answer these big threats. So if you're expecting a lot of Kinemon, you are in an amazing position in that matchup because Rush Luffy is crazy in that matchup because you can hit their threats without them using blockers, similar to Law, and those are decks that I would argue are somewhat popular. And on top of that, it doesn't really matter what hand you open because all hands kind of do a similar thing to accomplishing your game plan, which is what Zoro also does. That's why I have them both in tier 1 and they have the best searchers. Now I'm going to move on to my final deck in the tier 1 category, which is Red Green Law. Now, why I have this deck in this category is why I have Law valued in the tier 1 category as well. What do you know? You can also play Curly Dedan, which is one of the cards that's making these decks that were previously fairly consistent, super consistent. And on top of that, your entire game plan is to extract value and get infinite value from these searchers such as your Bonnie and Nami to where you overwhelm the other person in terms of card advantage. Now, Law is a deck that was super viable in set 1, and set 2, I think it took a bit of a hit because while you do get these cards that are extremely strong, such as Vista and Curly, you do actually become more susceptible to removal, because if they use a Vista effect back-to-back, which I've seen Cross AI, one of the best people on the deck, say this, that the mirror match is super RNG if someone has multiple back-to-back Vista effects, and that's where you take a trade-off with the Zoro and Luffy deck because you're more susceptible to those. But I think the biggest advantage you get is, number one, you have access to 3 searchers. Other decks only have 2, but on top of having 3 searchers, you can actually customize the deck and differentiate it in multiple different ways that can give you an advantage over people in other matchups. Whereas, like I said, the Zoro and Luffy deck are like 90% core cards. You can't really argue that you should change like 50% of the deck because some cards are just objectively way better than others. Law is the deck that you have the most flexibility in terms of deck building. So if you're a very strong deck builder, you can perform well with this deck. And I would like to state there are 2 distinct versions. You have, number 1, the more aggro classic version. I'm going to call this one the Cross AI Rider version, aka the bandwagon version, because everyone just kind of follows what he does, and I mean that's understandable because he wins a lot. But there's another version that just gets disregarded because he doesn't play that deck, and people are just really sheeps. So the version I'm talking about is the control version where you play 2 8-drop Captain Kid. And I think this is a really viable, untouched version that I don't know why I haven't seen people get success with, because in my experience playing 8-drop Kid in my green deck, I was winning so many matchups because some people still just cannot answer the card. Some people still can't answer the 8-drop Kid. On top of that, sometimes it doesn't matter what deck he's playing and what outs that the person could have. 8-drop Kid is just broken. You know, I found that people are like, yeah, 8-drop Kid is bad because if they have 9-drop character, he just kills your 8-drop Kid. Well, you forget to realize that in this deck, you can put up the 5-drop blocker law, which is the biggest advantage of that deck, because it demands not only a Vista effect, it also demands a Gordon or a double modifier. And that's a lot of resources to answer one thing. And you can put up the most low-value blockers over any deck utilizing this strategy. Not only that, the 8-drop wins you the mirror match. I would say the only disadvantage of the 8-drop currently is that so many people play the 9-drop and a good amount of people have modifiers, but because people aren't expecting it, if you go against the law mirror match and you see the guy use multiple Otamas, he uses multiple modifiers, you're going to be able to play into that and hold your 8-drop Kid till the end, and I think that's a really good strategy. As well, we've seen a lot of success with the blue deck happening because your boy is giving out the goo. Since I'm giving out so much free value, pause the video, smash the like button, and turn post notifications on. Okay, but on the real though, this card literally just claps all the people who are not good at blue or good at blue, because in addition to having the 8-drop, you also have the most low-value blockers, and it makes it so difficult for the guy to push through because he doesn't expect you to play that now. It adds so much value to the deck because no one understands that this is still a viable version. It beats blue. It beats green decks. Green has no out to the 8-drop Kid. If you go against a Kinemon person and you set up 8-drop Kid with 2 or 3 blockers, you also just win. Even if the guy has an Edward Newgate 9-drop, you could have a 5-cost law and 2 1-cost blockers. He kills a 1-cost blocker on attack. He still has to deal with your additional 2 blockers, and anything else, he's already invested 2 Dawn to his Newgate in order to use that effect, so now he even has a harder time to push through, especially in the Zoro matchup. Card is insane in the Zoro matchup because they're looking to only hit for 5Ks. The fact you put them on, they have to hit for 8K, it's crazy. And normally, it's really bad because the guy could go Jet Pistol Otama, but since no one expects it, they're going to brashly use these removal effects and modifiers, and you put it down, and you're like, haha, I win, you lose. Sign the slip. No, but for real though, like literally, try it at your locals and you'll see that even if the guy is supposed to be able to kill your 8-drop, sometimes you just can't because you're too broken. And the biggest reason why that's viable in the deck, on top of the surprise factor, is the fact that if you reveal it, you have so many supernovas, you can just add something else. I don't hear enough people say this, but when you are playing this version of Law, you have the best opportunity to play this card rather than a Green Kid player or a Kinemon player, because you can put this on the bottom of the deck in the matchups where it's not applicable, or if you just want to choose something now because you're not going to need it for later, you put it on the bottom, and then what happens is that you have 3 searchers, and if you know basic math, 7 searches gets you through your entire deck one time. So if you're keeping track of mental notes and you have a lot of reps with the deck, you can calculate how many searches you're away from getting to your 8-drop again, and you can plan that out. And that's one of the biggest levels of skill expression in the Law deck, is mapping out how many turns I'm away from cycling through my deck fully and remembering what first 5 cards I revealed. And to me, the fact you can control so many variables is super appealing. And on top of that, the other hand is that the cross AI build, it is really good versus Whitebeard. Because I think that's why most people have decided to like run a lot of copies of the Restand Law. I think the biggest advantage of it is in the Whitebeard matchup, you can hit with a high number on their leader, requiring them to use an event multiple times in one turn. And they may not have the Dawn to use multiple events, and they're at 0, so you can just kill them right off the bat. So all in all, there's different ways you can play the deck, and I enjoy the fact that from a deck building standpoint, you can gain a competitive edge over other people, and I think there's a lot of things that are untouched with this strategy. Now, the disadvantage of this deck is, number 1, it's really bad versus Red Luffy. Red Luffy almost like completely counters you, and number 2, I would say that the Whitebeard person, they have a chance to beat you as well. Pretty much anybody who plays 9-drop character has a chance to beat you, and that's just something that you have to be thinking about because that card is in everyone's deck. But if the person doesn't have 9-drop character in your deck, you're generally favored, and you can go 50-50 with this deck across all matchups, which is what we're looking to do when selecting a deck, because there are some decks that are literally playing rock, paper, scissors, i.e. you go against this matchup, you auto-win, i.e. you go against this matchup, you auto-lose, and Law isn't like that. Now, the problem with Law is that if you don't see Bonnie early, you kind of just lose. But there, to compensate for that, if you open a specific sequence, like multiple searchers back-to-back, or Bonnie Law, and you're able to protect your searchers, you also just auto-win, no matter what the other guy is playing. So there are give and takes to the deck. I personally don't like it as much as other people, only for the reason being that I feel like I see people, they'll miss with one search, and it kind of costs you the game. Because they don't have the ability to protect that searcher and play it in the same turn. You don't always have the resources and the advantage to do that, so you have to take risks, and you can just brick sometimes. But all in all, I mean, it's still a really good deck, and the fact that you can differentiate yourself from other people is a really good advantage that can be touched on in a lot of decks. And that's why I put it in the Tier 1 category. To wrap things up, 3 searchers, versatility, and a good Whitebeard matchup, which is extremely played if you're using that version. And on top of that, Bonnie is just one of the most broken cards in the game. I remember when I first started out, and I was playing Blurple Croc, and I was playing blue and purple and other decks, and I just realized, like, wait, I would go against these people who had a Bonnie, and they would use the effect, and then I was like, wait, this is so broken. Then I played the deck, and I played a deck with Bonnie in it, and I was like, wait, why would I ever use a deck that doesn't use Bonnie? This is just so unfair. The fact that if you can protect it and there was less removal at that time, you could just get infinite value and you just beat the guy off the bat. So I really recommend that you get used to playing this deck and playing flexibly, because it'll teach you a lot of core mechanics. Even if it's not your objective to play this deck, it'll just make you a better player. And I would say this is a prime example of a deck that everyone should learn to add another layer to their skill set, because we're going to see other combo decks going forward in the future of the game for sure. So you might as well be acclimated to this play style, so when the meta changes, you actually know how to play all different styles of decks. So that's going to wrap up the tier 1 category. And I think you could really win with any of those decks, get a first place finish. And you could win with any of these decks, like I said, but it's very likely we're going to see someone get a first place finish with those. Now, in the tier 1.5 category, I'm going to start off with Whitebeard, both versions. Now, the reason why I rank this one lower is a concept that a lot of people overlook. Number one, this is a concept that a lot of people overlook. The Whitebeard deck, on paper, is not statistically as the Whitebeard deck on paper is not statistically as consistent as the other strategies I listed above, because you don't have access to any searchers unless you're playing Straw Hat. Then you have one searcher, and you have to think that sometimes you can lose to yourself even if you draw optimally. And what I mean by that is, I think a large reason why a lot of Whitebeard people are overrepresenting the top cut is because, number one, a bunch of people play the deck, like so many. And eventually, if you're just going in mirror matches, one person's eventually going to win and naturally bring a couple people to the top cut. Two, the deck, like, if you open a good hand, you have a fair chance to beat anyone. My problem is, if you draw too many events at one time, or too many cards with no counter, and the other guy is a good player, he can take risks to punch you in the face where you don't have enough Dawn to play the events you have, or events are in your life and you're tapped out, and you just can't stop them from going for lethal. Because the Whitebeard deck it's very misleading. When I go for lethal on you, you could have 7 cards in hand, but then you could have 4 or 5 cards that you couldn't even play, and I could push for lethal, but most people don't think about that. On top of that, the game is still relatively new, and other people coming from other games are coming from very different games. When you think about what the Whitebeard deck does, it causes the other guy to play in a different way that he's not naturally acclimated to play against, and you see that in a lot of tournaments, where sometimes the person who wins the die roll may not choose the best decision for themselves. Like, I see people choose to let the Whitebeard guy go first, and I'm like, bro, the real rationale here is the highest percentage of people on the most popular variant is the Straw Hat variant. And I don't want to let that guy go first because he can play 9-drop character on curve. The entire game plan of Strawbeard is for you to play 9-drop on curve as soon as possible with the highest amount of life so you can stabilize at 2 life on turn 5. And that is very powerful if the guy gets to do that. But if you can rush the guy down and put him at 1 or 0 on that integral turn, he's almost giving up priority to actually play that Whitebeard. Now, the reason being is that if he is to play that Whitebeard, you might be able to still push for lethal, and then he just tapped out to where he can't put up blockers, he may not even play blockers, or he can only hover 1 event, which stops only 1 attack. And if you're going against a guy which has high power bodies, he might be able to push through. A prime example of this is at the Peoria, Illinois regional. I went against a very strong Whitebeard player, and the guy had literally 3 Whitebeards back to back to back on curve. And you know what I did? I hit him 8 in the face with 4 characters in a row, and he just so happened to hit a 4th Whitebeard in life and have an event. And he didn't have enough counters to get out of 4 attacks. And that's why I say, if people played differently and were super familiar with this strategy, that it would not be as highly represented in the top cut. Don't get me wrong. Don't take this as a misconception that I'm saying this deck is bad. You know, some people say that and think that I think this way because I made a short about it. I made other content saying I don't think it's the best deck. And that's because I think that there's a strong difference in consistency with this deck than the decks I put in tier 1. And also, you got to think, so many people play this deck, you can't really differentiate yourself that much. And the mirror match is super RNG based. I just saw a recent video by Los Fiends. Shout out to him. He's a GOAT. Hopefully I get to meet him someday. But he was basically just saying that he lost in top 32 or something like that in the Whitebeard mirror. And I don't, I don't believe that he's incorrect with that statement. There's a lot of RNG factors. You know, he was basically explaining that if you have 5-drop Luffy into Ace, into Whitebeard, the other guy basically can't win. And that's very true. You know, you think about the mirror match, it's super swingy. If it's Straw Hat versus Straw Hat, the guy who goes first has an extreme advantage. If it's Straw Hat versus Stagebeard, if the guy who's playing Stagebeard pretty much wins unless the Straw Hat guy went first and went back-to-back-to-back Whitebeard. And that's because the deck just integrally counters the Straw Hat variant. And you're taking a lot of risk with that because you can't differentiate yourself from other people. And also, you somewhat live and die by the top 15 cards of your deck. The cards you draw from your life and the cards you draw from your hand, because at that point, you're on a clock to where the guy will eventually kill you if you don't end the game first. Also, I don't think there's that many ways you can differentiate yourself from other people in a skillful way in terms of core mechanics. Now with Zoro, you can't differentiate your deck that much from other people, or Luffy, but it's arguably one of the most skill-intensive strategies in terms of core mechanics when you're playing aggro v aggro. Knowing how to value resources and knowing how much Dawn you should allocate is super important. Well, in Whitebeard, it's pretty self-explanatory. The deck is busted because if you curve out, you're broken as hell. Honestly, both versions are very similar to what we saw in set 1 with the Kaido deck and your ability to just high roll people if you curve out, except you don't live and die by opening a stage card. Now in the Stagebeard deck, you do a little bit more, but you can still see that card later in the game, not just on turn 1, and it has a trigger effect, so it's quite a bit more consistent than that, but I wouldn't put it as highly as these other mono-red strategies. And on top of that, I personally think that there's no reason to play a mono-red deck unless you can play Curly to Dan, because it just increases your consistency so much. Overall, to wrap this up, the Whitebeard deck is good, but there's a lot of RNG factors, and you can't differentiate your deck that much. But I think that if we have the Ezo Searcher coming out in set 3, it changes the game entirely. I don't want to spend too much time on this one, so we're going to move on. But that's still a viable strategy. You should expect to see a couple of those. And, oh, one last thing. Bro, if you want to cheat with that deck, like I explained in the other video, a lot of malicious people will play that in online events. Not calling anyone specifically malicious for playing the deck, but there's certain aspects that can allow you to soft cheat better than other people, because all your cards do the same thing, and stacking is easier when you've got one card in each pile. Oh, and your Nami has less value than these other mono-red strategies. I understand why people think that the Straw Hat variant is super consistent. My take on why it's not that consistent is because even when you use a Nami, you have less options on what you can play. So you can't add like really powerful cards such as Jet Pistol because it doesn't work that well with the deck. And on top of that, like all the cards you're adding basically do the same thing. You can add a 2K counter, a vanilla, or in best case scenario, an event. You know, that it really just adds cards that are all within the similar role. Whereas in these other mono-red decks, you have way more options, increasing the value overall of your Nami. Now, we're going to move on to the two green boys. Shout out to my boy Andreas, because he has proved me time and time again that green is extremely viable and it's extremely underplayed. If you've been following one of my earliest videos this format, I said that in the green Kinemon deck, it's a really strong deck to get a top placing with, but it's difficult to get first place. And that's why I have it in the tier 1.5 category. The reason being is, in order to get the most value out of your leader, you need to see a 3-drop Wano card on turn 1 on the draw so that you can effectively cheat out something such as no Kiku or a Raizo. Now, you can do that consistently at locals, but in an 8-round tournament, you're not going to be able to open a turn 1 3 cost every single game. I've mentioned this before, but when you're in Top Cut, it's best 2 out of 3. And for you to say, I'm going to open a 3-drop Wano 2 or 3 games out of that series, then you're putting a lot of luck involved into your winnings. And I just don't like it for that reason. That's why I have it in tier 1.5, because it's still really strong. It's just, you kind of live or die by doing that in some cases, because we're in such a race-based meta to where if you miss with that, sometimes it can put you too far behind from the other player when everyone is, putting a lot of pressure on the leader, and most people don't play that many low-cost blockers. I think that the Kinemon deck and the Whitebeard deck are very similar in the case that they both really put a lot of weight on the way you win is by curving out effectively. I'm not going to lie. If you curve out really well, you can do insane things in Kinemon. I lost to my 2 people in the Peoria, Illinois regional because they went turn 1 Okiku, turn 2 Discount Yamato, turn 3 X-Drake, turn 4 Capone Gang Beige plus Kazuki Odin, turn 5 Capone Gang Beige plus Kazuki Odin. And that specific sequence caused me my 2 losses in that regional, and I would argue that I could not beat that sequence no matter what hand I opened and no matter what deck I played. And for that reason, the green deck has a very high power ceiling. The problem is, even though you have these searchers, it seems consistent on paper, but when we miss that turn 1 drop, you need to be able to make up that incremental dawn advantage throughout the game, or you're going to lose. Because at that point, you're essentially using a vanilla leader when you miss your curve, and you could have just been using Eustass Kid leader, which has more value in the late game than in the early game. When you're playing any kind of green strategy, you have to think about the fact that if you lose board in the early to mid game, it's almost impossible for you to come back if the other person is keeping a good pace and is a skill-based player. And I have a lot of people ask me this, like, how do you beat green with blue? And I'll tell you straight up to your face. I've had this conversation with a lot of people. People think it's crazy that I'm beating so many green people. Well, I have 10 years of card game experience, and I understand how to create mind games and to create skillful lines of play that the other guy may not see coming, and that's allowed me to outskill a lot of people that they arguably should have beaten me with their curve, but I've equally lost to some people because they curved out insane. So, I mean, in terms of green, the biggest advantage is you are extremely favored versus Zoro. If you're playing Kinemon, that is. You're just super fast-paced, and you can play for board. If you're able to tap their guys and kill them before they're able to attack next turn with value from their Zoro Dawn investment, then you're going to be able to control the pace of the game, and the only way the guy can beat you is by going back-to-back Edward Newgate, but the same could be said in any matchup where the guy has back-to-back Edward Newgate. It's already so hard to come back from that if you don't have your own back-to-back Edward Newgate. I would also like to mention that one of the biggest points of interest for the green strategy right now is the fact that you can play X-Drake. Now, this card is very underutilized. It is good in almost every matchup. Whitebeard we have seen to be the most highly represented deck in almost all big events. And in this matchup, you're going to be able to kill their vanillas that are 4 cost 6k, and you're just generating so much value. You generate a body that is on par for the stat line of 5 cost 6k, arguably the best stat line in the game in terms of base mechanics, and on top of that, you're removing a 4 cost unit of theirs, giving you a huge tempo swing. Tempo is so important right now, and that is one of the cards that can actually let you come back on board when you lost it in the early to mid game. It also just destroys blue. You know, blue is one of my favorite decks, and I've gotten a lot of people on it, and I've just found, like I mentioned in my story, that if the guy has X-Drake, you almost just can't even win no matter what your hand is, because all my cards are 4, and they're only even good because I got a discount from my leader. So for that reason, X-Drake is crazy, and my boy Andreas, he has just proved how valuable that is as a resource. On top of that, we have access to Punk Gibson, arguably one of the best events in the game, and it plays very well into that Whitebeard matchup like I was stating. If you rest their 4 cost 6k with the ability, or if you rest one of their guys because it has a broken trigger effect, you're almost just giving yourself a free destruction because of that X-Drake and the fact that X-Drake is searchable. On top of that, we also have access to Jewelry Bonnie, which I noted was arguably the best card in OPO1. this card gets you access to a wide number of cards that fill all kinds of different rules, all kinds of different roles. You know, with your Nami in the Whitebeard deck, it adds a lot of cards that do the same thing. Well, in the green strategy with your Bonnie, I would argue you have the highest opportunity to add a lot of versatility to the current game state. And that is a huge advantage. It allows you to create skill expression, it allows you to create differentiation in your list from other people, and there are a lot of ways you can approach the game with this deck. So all in all, the green Kinemon strategy is a very consistent one in terms of being able to access your pieces that you want anytime throughout the game. And the issue with it is that it relies a lot on that curve, because you can add those cards at any point in the game, but it may not be the appropriate time to play them. And that goes for such cards as the 5-cost Yamato from set 1. That card is amazing. No one can deny that. But you also cannot deny that it has a very small window of when the card is going to see a high impact in a lot of matchups. And that has to do with the fact that it dies to any modifier plus a Vista effect, which is running rampant in the meta, and even if you get your 1 Dawn discount, it's still like, I mean, he just removed it for the same cost. Why does he get to do that? I had to get a tax refund to play out my Yamato, and this guy just kills it for free? Like, what? That's literally so busted. But the green strategy kills blue in general. It also is insane versus Zoro. The Whitebeard matchup is very fickle. If you tailor your deck to beat the Whitebeard matchup, you take disadvantages in other regards. Oh, and also, the Luffy deck, we've seen a wide rise in usage of this strategy, and I think that you have the best chance to beat green with Luffy because of the value that Rush Luffy presents, being able to attack your big threats while disregarding your blockers. Because the big mechanic of green is you have so many blockers that can make up for not having as much counter in hand and having cards with no counter. So there's a lot of ways you can play the deck. It's very strong, but I wouldn't say it's as consistent as those mono red decks. Well, you do have the 2 searchers, and they can arguably get infinite value. You are losing in the regard that you can't just open any sequence of cards and do the same thing that your game plan is looking to accomplish. You want to get out your Odin and double attack the guy and create a lethal situation where you normally would not be able to lethal the other player. And on top of that, you can also get a lot of versatility off of your Odin being KO'd. You can summon a blocker. You can summon a Izo, which rests someone, nullifying an additional attack, stopping them from lethaling you, or you can summon an Okiku, which sets up you to disregard their blocker on their return, creating a lethal situation for you and swinging the tempo in your favor. So, very strong deck. I highly recommend that you play around with not just net decking and differentiating the deck to what you meta call. That's where you're going to see the highest amount of success, and I would like to see more people play the deck. Because, number one, I'm off blue, so I don't have to worry about you guys cucking me, but it's just a good deck, and not that many people are playing it for what value it's presenting. And in terms of Eustass Kid, you are doing a completely different thing. Now, you have a higher chance to win with Kinemon versus Whitebeard, even though it's not the best matchup, but when you're playing Eustass Kid, it's super difficult to beat Whitebeard. That's because the new form that Eustass Kid has taken is we want to hide behind our 5-cost Yamato. The A-Drop Kid is amazing, and if you were watching my 3v3 tournament, Eustass Kid leader was insane because I went against 2 blue players. I also think it is probably the best deck to go against Zoro because the 8-drop is so oppressive. When you have 4 copies, even if they have the removal to kill it, you just replace it with another one. And when you have that 5-cost Yamato, a lot of people will not get as much value out of the deck as is available because they don't understand when to attack the opposing leader. Ideally, you would wait until the very end of the game to even deal a damage to the other person if they're not playing Whitebeard in order to starve them of resources. And this is something that a lot of the highly skilled players found out very early on in OPO 1 and used this to create a lot of wins that they shouldn't have normally been able to, because the other person would just attack their leader mindlessly and they would choose not to attack, which, giving your opponent one card in the Green Kid mirror is the difference between winning and losing. So now the new strategy is you starve them of resources, put out your 5-drop Yamato, and this card has a completely different value in this deck than Kinemon. You heard me say a second ago that this Yamato has a small window to generate value in that strategy. Well, in this strategy, it is something you live and die by. Because if you're not playing against Whitebeard, you're going to starve them out of resources, put up your 8 drops, they're going to waste time attacking that, and you're going to get to a point where your 5-drop is going to hit them, and it has infinite value essentially, because you can wait till the end of the game to put that card out, where the guy has already used all of his removal effects, and if he has no cards in hand but 5 life, and you just want to sit there, wall up, search for a blocker every turn, nullifying their leader from getting through your 8-cost Captain Kid shield, you're going to take 2 life from them, it goes to the trash, they gain no cards, and if you play it short, sweet, and simple, and like to play with a boring mindset, you're going to win, and the guy has no chance to beat you with RNG effects. He can't even use triggers because you're banishing. So you're eliminating all these factors this guy has to high roll you, such as triggering a jet pistol in the life, or triggering a Gum Gum Red Hawk, which is by far the most degenerate thing you can do in the current game. Why are triggers in the game? Like, on a side note, why are triggers in the game? There's literally no reason to have triggers, because all of the cards that have a good trigger, no one plays them just because it's a trigger effect. People play them because they're already busted cards, such as Jet Pistol. If that had no trigger effect, you would still play it. But the thing is, if you do get the trigger effect, it just removes skill from the game. It's literally just a win more option that's already on busted cards, and that's unfair. And that's why it's super nice to have that 5-drop Yamato, because you just disregard that. You get to mitigate the opportunity for your opponent to beat you, even though they're worse at the game and they just hit a trigger. So that's super nice about the deck, and I think that it is the best deck to beat Zoro. It is the best deck to beat Blue. If you go against Blue, you can almost never lose because you have 4 8-drop, and you can be super greedy. In set 1, people had to play 7-drop, people had to play Basil Hawkins, which were cards that were specifically good in the green v green mirror match, but now you get to make your deck even more powerful. I would argue in some instances, the Green Kid could be considered a better option than choosing Kinemon to bring to an event, because not many people are on green, so you don't have to run these options that were put in the deck in the first place to combat the popularity of green, and you can focus on those core matchups which are being highly represented, such as your Whitebeard, your Zoro, and your Law. And on top of that, what's really nice is, I would say that the Green Kid mirror match and the Green Kinemon mirror match, you have a lot of skill expression where you have the opportunity to beat the guy even though your hand wasn't the best, and if everything was played out correctly, you should lose. So that's super nice for me because it feels super rewarding. In my experience of playing that Eustass Kid deck, I felt like every game, even when I won, I felt like I could do something better. And the fact that you can look back and say, I can improve in this area, it just feels so stimulating and so rewarding to put in the reps. Similarly to Law, except the mirror match is actually fair. So I think those are probably your top contenders for taking the whole event. And I would say the biggest disadvantage of that Green Kid deck is in that Whitebeard matchup. I didn't mention how this works out, but when you have that 5-drop Yamato and your deck is centered around that, it's basically a useless card, because you got to think, my entire game plan is built around starving the other guy of resources and not taking their life. Well, he's naturally going to take his life on his own. So that kind of cucks you, and you could arguably just not have that card in your deck and just have a bunch of X-Drakes because it's doing nothing for you. The guy's at 0, and you have a double attack banish, which basically says, I paid 5 Dawn to play a 5k character. And you're like, wait, what? Why is this in my deck? But, okay, the other advantage I forgot to mention is that you have a higher versatility out of both of your searchers. I think it's not correct to run 4 Bonnie and 4 Momonosuke in the Kinemon deck based on the sheer differential of how high value the Wano cards are in that deck with the cost reduction versus the Supernova package. In this version of the green deck, you have an equally high chance to search for a different card for each purpose. Your Momonosuke in the Kinemon deck essentially only searches for offensive options unless you're a dirty high roller and you play Kazuki Toki, because you can add the 3-cost Nekomamushi blocker, which is great because we can play it off our Eustass Kid. We can also play it off of our 5-drop Law, so it has more value even though it's a no counter card, and even if we have too many no counter cards, our leader discards it. You don't see Kinemon playing that card to summon off the Odin because you can't discard it. And, you know, the fundamental problem is that you have too many cards with no counter. Well, that's thrown out the window when you're playing the Eustass Kid leader deck. And I also just think, like, you have a higher chance to express more skill because there's a lot that goes into how much Dawn should I allocate to my leader so I can create a double attack situation, and how much should I mind game in that regard. So the fact that you can just use Momo to add potentially Odin if you want to play that, 4-drop Yamato in terms of a setup card, which is what I consider a tapper, a 2K in the form of your Izo, a blocker in the form of your Nekomamushi, you have such a wide utility to add. And your Bonnie has the same utility. You can add blockers, you can add 8-drop, you can add another Bonnie. You know, same could be said for Momo, and Momo gets to add Yamato. And since we can go through our deck so fast, because we're going to make the game go into the late game, we're going to have such a high reward for memorizing our deck. If we memorize how many cycles we're away from getting to that 5-drop Yamato, we can bottom deck it in the beginning of the game with our Momo, because we know we need that card at the end of the game and not the beginning unless it just is in your hand and it curves out effectively. So super strong deck. Highly recommend you check out Eustass Kid. Another one of those decks that just rewards you from becoming a better player. And it rewards you for learning from your mistakes, which is something I see a lot of people disregard in terms of how high their potential is as a competitive player. Look back over your games. Decide what's going to make you better. How are you going to become better? You can't just say the guy had back-to-back-to-back Whitebeard. Well, I need to go back and see, could I have analyzed things differently? Could have I approached it in a different way? And could I have taken risks? Because I see a lot of people sit there and try to play safe. Sometimes you just have to think, if this guy has back-to-back Whitebeard, I might just lose confirmed. And if that's the case, I need to take a risky situation to go for lethal. And I've seen some high-level people do that and be rewarded. You can't win every game, but when you set yourself up to be in the mindset to make the best decision possible, you're going to win more games overall, and I'm going to regard you as a better player than someone who just got lucky and won one tournament. So the second deck that we're going to, okay, so that's all for tier 1.5. Now we're going to talk about tier 2. These are decks, like I said before, that can be good depending on what you're expecting in the metagame, but they have a couple fundamental losing matchups or rock, paper, scissors matchups at the rock, paper, scissors tournament that make it risky, and they're not as consistent as these other strategies. The first one we're going to talk about is, you already know, the Giga Chad Doflamingo. Let's go! You already know. The Doflamingo goat is in the house, so prepare to turn up the volume, because I'm giving out the goo. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you. The Doflamingo is a tier 1 deck in any circumstance, but you can consider it tier 1 depending on when the tournament was. At the time, when I brought it to the regional, I think it was very strongly decisive. It's a tier 1 option, because not many people were bringing green, and most people thought that Whitebeard was the best deck. Doflamingo, the biggest advantage to it is you have the biggest matchup win percentage versus Whitebeard. We touched on how if you play Whitebeard and you curve out effectively, the other guy has no chance to win. You know, that's why Moby Dick's getting banned. It's literally just so broken. But in the blue deck, what I like about it is, even if the guy soft cheats, even if the guy just has randomly another card, like, you can sometimes just still win. Because your fundamental game plan is that you want to use your leader ability to trade away their board and gain infinite value, similarly to someone using a Bonnie every turn, except we don't have to see a specific card to access our engine to fulfill our game plan. We just need to see a stacker, and I played 10 stackers in my previous list shown on the channel. Make sure to go check it out if you want to hear about my list and as well hear me rant about cheaters in a funny and comical way. With the Doflamingo deck, I honestly feel like no matter who you go against, if you're able to continue the stack forever and you play first, it's almost impossible for the other guy to win. And the way I built my deck in that tournament was so that I felt like if I was able to access my engine and continue the stack for as long as possible, I usually won, no matter what the matchup was. I went against 4 laws, won 3 out of 4 of them. And that's the biggest disadvantage with Dofi, is that the law matchup is really bad. But I was able to display skill expression and take advantage of my opponents not understanding the blue archetype. I know multiple people who don't know that much about blue because they haven't played it personally. So they can't anticipate to the full value what you could do to defend in scenarios and what you have coming. And if you've gotten a lot of reps like me, that's where you get rewarded. And that's why I originally liked blue, because you're able to create new variables such as managing the deck and cycling through in a different way than searchers work. So it's adding another layer of skill expression. And so versus the law people, a lot of times they didn't value their resources efficiently, and that's how I was able to beat them. But in general, the way you lose, and I've stated this so many times, if the guy has 8-drop Kid, you don't automatically lose. What happens is you lose if the guy has multiple blockers because the deck has no hard removal, and the whole point of your deck is to trade away their board to generate value. Well, if you can't trade away their board because they're getting rid of chumps and replacing them with a new chump blocker on the following turn, you're effectively not even using a leader ability. And you can only put out 1 to 2 characters per turn. And that's why I highly recommend Edward Weevil in the deck, because if you miss with a stacker and you don't have a stacker turn 1, then you don't want to have to go for a blind hit turn 2. Because if you're building the deck effectively, and you have to go for a blind hit turn 2 because you legally cannot play any cards because they're all 4 cost, then what you're going to have to do is take a 50-50 chance to summon a guy, and if you miss, that just means in some matchups where it's extremely race-based, which is arguably all the matchups in the meta, you're going to get too far behind and you can't come back. So that's why I think you have to play the 1-drop Dofi, at least to some extent, and potentially you could play Desert Spada. There are disadvantages and advantages in that regard, but the blue deck is really good for expressing your level of skill and increasing your ability to become a better player. And also, like I said before, I've met some people who have won, like, Treasure Cups or got top placing at Treasure Cup, and they don't know how to fully utilize the blue deck. So you can bait them and make them think you don't have enough counter, or you can counter out of hand weirdly. And the guy thinks you can kill your he can kill your character, but he actually can't, and you end up swinging the board. So the deck is really strong versus Whitebeard, like I stated. That's because I can threaten their character every turn. I naturally want to hit for 7, so I'm essentially not being taxed in the same way as other people do. And I can create a character on my own off that effect. And also, Jinbei is broken. In every matchup besides Whitebeard, the effect is so impactful that if you hit a blind Jinbei or a turn 2 Jinbei at all, it's so hard for the other guy to come back. One of the ways you can actually overcome the law matchup is by summoning Jinbei. I stated before in another video, Jinbei creates a +1 in card advantage no matter what. Well, Jinbei also just removes cards they're protecting because they have blockers. It allows you to get rid of those infinite value searchers, and so does the 1-drop Dofi, making those cards extremely impactful in the current metagame. And the biggest thing blue has going for it is you can capitalize on people who are not playing these low-cost blockers because of how many Vista effects there are, and that allows you to get the most value out of your leader. The biggest problem is, number one, if a lot of people are playing 8-drop Kid, which for some reason, people just don't like green right now, and people also don't like to play Law with 8-drop Kid, it makes it, like, really easy for you to beat people if you don't go against those matchups. But if they do have the 8-drop, and they have those 3 blockers set up, and you have no way to remove them, you didn't Jinbei them, you don't have the 1-drop Dofi to get rid of their beige, then you're just going to lose automatically. Like, that's one of the times where you can actually just scoop. And I think that's been proven time and time again. But don't just sit there and say, he had an 8-drop, I couldn't win. Bro, if you tailor your deck to beat that, and you go against that, you have at least a 50% chance to win. You know, at one point, I had 18 wins versus Kinemon and 2 losses with my blue deck in tournaments. And, you know, that's largely because, number one, people are cutting down those blockers, but also I was able to differentiate myself with deck building, skill expression, and what the other guy thought I could do. Whereas now, I think the blue deck has more of a depreciating value because more people are starting to play blue itself. And the mirror match is completely RNG. Whoever draws Mihawk and plays first wins because you have no removal and there's no way to get rid of that card if the other guy wants to protect it. And that's why I stopped playing the deck, because so many people got on it that it made it less viable. On top of that, I think it's consistent, but not as consistent as the decks I put in tier 1 with your Nami and your Dedan. But I do think that it's really strong versus red, and that was the focal point of me bringing it to these tournaments. If you go versus red, you meta call you're going against red, and it doesn't matter how good the guy is. I will restate, anyone can beat anyone, and by bringing blue and only going against red, you are going to have a good time, and you should top if you play everything in the correct order. So I think blue's a good deck, but I'm putting it in tier 2 at this current standpoint because more and more people are playing the mirror, and it's just very skill-less, to be honest with you. A lot of that skill expression has been taken away, and it really shows with the data. We've been seeing less and less Dofi people topping, rather than like a couple weeks ago, it had a high number of tops. But it's still a good deck, and I think it's super fun. What's nice about this game is, first TCG that actually appeals to a casual player base, meaning that even if you are not as competitive, if your favorite deck is Kaido from the anime, you can still beat anyone, because anyone can beat anyone. So don't put blue on the back end, because you can still win with it, but because so many people are playing Law right now, and you have a bad Law matchup, I've decided to stop playing the deck. If you don't expect to go against a lot of Law, if you don't expect to go against 4 Law in a row like me, you're probably going to do good. Now we're going to move on to Kaido, and then Smoker. Kaido is a deck that you can go 50-50 in any matchup. And while it only has one searcher via the Impel Down engine, I see people in the comments talking so much trash saying Kaido is garbage, stop saying it's good, you never play with the deck. Bro, I don't play with the deck because I play with it in set 1, and I generally speaking just don't enjoy the playstyle that much. But if you enjoy the playstyle, it's a very good deck. Because, number one, it teaches you how to manage resources, because it's all removal. So you got to decide, is it worth it to remove his card with my card, and when should I do so? That's going to differentiate yourself from the other people. The disadvantage to it is that in the mirror match, it's pretty skill-less, because you got to think, whoever holds their 10-drop Kaido the longest wins, but there's not many mirror matches, which adds an appreciating value to this strategy. You could arguably put this deck in tier 1.5. I have it in 2 because it doesn't have 2 searchers. Number 2, we don't have a lot of data to support that, and all of my decisions are based off of data and based off of math, because I'm not going to sit here and tell you guys anecdotal evidence from just stuff I've experienced, but there is math behind it in the Japanese meta, which had the exact same card pool for us, and you've seen multiple people top these events with Kaido, and from a small amount of people playing the deck, it's got pretty good tops. And I think that a biggest misconception about it is you live or die by the stage. Well, the thing is, with the Impel Down engine, not only do you have a way better matchup versus Zoro versus Luffy, it makes it to where if you don't have stage, you can play the Impel Down engine and you don't automatically lose. Because what the stage does is it compensates for the fact that you have a very few amount of cards that you are able to put on the board in the early game, allowing the other guy to take control of the race before you can capitalize and stabilize at a high health total at the end of the game. With the Impel Down engine, you are fulfilling the same role, but people just disregard that. Because what you can do is you could go turn 1 Hannibal, search for Hell's Judgment, which in my opinion is the most broken event to come out of this set. Card literally mitigates 2 attacks. If you're meta calling a lot of green, this deck could be tier 1.5 or tier 1 because the green matchup is crazy. If you use Hell's Judgment on the guy's Kazuki Odin, that's literally broken. If you use Hell's Judgment on the guy's leader and he's playing Eustass Kid, literally broken because you're denying 2 attacks with 1. And if they don't order their Dawn correctly, you can actually just deny 2 attacks. And it's just insane in that regard. On top of that, if you make it to the late game, one of the best late game strategies, and it doesn't matter what matchup you're in, if you play 10 drop on curve, you win. Like, literally, if you play 10 drop on curve and the other guy didn't open an insane curve, you win. It's the only card in the game that allows you to directly answer the 9-drop character Edward Newgate, potentially back-to-back, if you're able to stabilize the high enough health total. And on top of that, the Impel Down engine, the reason why I'm saying you can fulfill the same role as the stage is because you could also add a Little Sadie and or a Minotaur blocker, which is a 4-cost 5k blocker. On turn 2, instead of playing stage, you go Little Sadie, which generates a body in order to play a 4-cost 5k blocker. If you Hannibaled on turn 1, that means that you are playing a total of 3 characters on turn 2, and those are high value versus those red decks because your Little Sadie and your Hannibal trade very well into Makino, into tapped Namis boosted with the Makino, into Magura. It stops people from playing Searchers because people can't tap their Bonnie or their Momonosuke without you killing it on the following turn. And that really compensates for that package. And you have the Shiru card, which is a 4-cost that says -1 Dawn, kill something that is 1 or less. There are so many viable 1-drops that allows you to compensate for the deficiencies the deck had against the Zoro deck in set 1. Don't get me wrong, one of your worst matchups is the Zoro deck, but you have a fair chance to win with this new support, which in set 1, you honestly had no ability to actually control the game and win. So I think the deck is very strong. There was actually a guy I read an article on. He won a major tournament in Japan because he had to step away for some school and military service. Came back. He's like, I don't know much about OPO2. I'm going to just play Kaido. And, you know, it's relatively the same deck as set 1. So good longevity investment to just have, like, you know, some fun at locals and, you know, still get better at the game, still have a chance to win. This guy got 2nd place or 1st place in an event where it was like 500 people and top 2 qualify for the next round or whatever. So that just proves it's a viable deck. And people disregard it. And also, the biggest advantage of Kaido is if you actually beat the guy, he gets so fuming. I don't know why. Like, I'm a super nice guy, but for some reason, some of these sweaty people, maybe it's because they were planning on cheating, and when you play 10-drop, it doesn't matter if the guy cheats, you're still just busted. But when you beat these people with Kaido, I've heard so many stories of people I don't know, people who are my friends, people I just observe at the tournament. The guy gets super, super mad that he lost to you because he's like, so RNG, so RNG. It's like, bro, anybody can beat anybody, man. Get better. That's all I have to say. But I think it's a very viable deck. And in the same regard is Smoker. So advantages of Kaido, you can go 50-50 in any matchup, which is super nice when the meta is broad and you don't know what to expect. Super good versus Green, super good versus Whitebeard, bad versus Zoro. Luffy's a little bit better, but still bad versus Luffy. And versus Law, you can sometimes cheese them depending on what build they play. Obviously better versus the control build, but regardless, 10-drop on curve against Law, removing their entire board is crazy. Now, I wanted to talk about Smoker in the same category because Smoker fits that same role as well. You got to think most of the matchups Kaido has are pretty much similar to Smoker. The difference is with Smoker, you actually just clap Kaido because it's kind of like doing what the same thing that you're doing in Kaido, but a little bit more consistent, I guess, if you want to even say that. The problem is you lose even harder to Zoro. Like with Smoker, like you really just can't beat Zoro. I don't care what you do. If the guy is a good Zoro player, you lose. And with Smoker, I think that's the biggest disadvantage is that Mono Red is so highly played that it's so difficult to, justify bringing it to a tournament and topping. But we saw a guy top with it recently, so, it's a good strategy to bring. And I don't want to get a lot of people off the Navy, but this is, I would say, the gatekeeper of what you should be bringing to a competitive tournament. Because you're losing in the mono red matchups outside of Whitebeard, and you're good against all other matchups, essentially. You have at least a 50% chance to win or more, and you also clap the Kaido. So if there's a random Kaido guy, shake his hand and put your 10 drop on top of his leader, and you're good to go. I mean, put your 10 drop on top of his leader. That'd be pretty funny. But I would say the biggest disadvantage of Smoker is that sometimes in some matchups, you live and die by your Kuzan 10 drop, and there's no searchers, which is really unfortunate, on top of the fact that all your powerful cards have no counter, and you have, no way to really, search, so it's and some of the cards are too slow. You think about what 4-cost Kuzan does for the deck, it draws you a card on play, which on paper is broken. One of the only cards in the game that replaces itself on play. The problem with that is, it's a 4-Dawn investment, even though you drew a card, the other guy could respond with a Vista plus a Otama, or Vista plus Gordon, or he just has a Jet Pistol. He answers it super efficiently. If he uses a Vista effect or a Nico Robin, he essentially just cleared your card for nothing, and the Smoker deck is already susceptible to people rushing you down. So against Smoker, you want to close out the game as fast as possible, because it's another one of those decks where you go into the late game, you're probably going to lose. And so that's what really sucks about Smoker, is because your cards, they're built to go into the late game, but you don't have the sustainability to do so. Now, you do have cards like Impact Wave, and you have other things that you can mess around with, but overall, the deck is not consistent enough to justify me personally bringing this to a big event, but you can prove me wrong. If you just luck out and go against no Zoro, you're going to do good. In my online regional where I went 7-2, went against 1 Zoro. At the Peoria regional, I went against 2 Zoro. You can get lucky and not go against that deck, but I have it rated below Dofi and below Kaido for the time being, because recently we've seen a resurgence in Zoro, and I think it really is difficult to justify bringing it when you're seeing so many people top with Zoro and now Luffy. And the other thing is, I would say with Kaido, you have a much better chance to beat Kinemon. I think sometimes if the Kinemon person curves out versus Smoker, he might be able to just race you down with his Kazuki Odin, and that's a deficiency you have to deal with. But that's going to be the last deck that we're going to talk about. Once again, I'm not talking about other decks because those decks you could win with, but it's very unlikely. You have to get a decent amount of luck, and I'm not saying you can't win with them, but I'm giving you guys the most objectively competitive decks that you can bring to one of these tournaments. And with that note, my honorable mentions, I'm going to go very quickly through these because the video is getting kind of long. First honorable mention is Magellan. People will say, you can win with Magellan, people topped. Yes, you can, but you could also top with Kaido. Magellan is just Kaido, except you pretty much have to go first in order to fulfill your game plan, because that's how your curve is set out to be. When you're playing Kaido, you can justify going first or second. With Magellan, if you want to get the most value out of it, you have to go first. And on top of that, your leader ability is essentially nothing. I played against people who curved out with Magellan, and the guy literally just made it look like he had a vanilla leader ability, because that ability almost only has synergy with 1 to 2 cards. Off the top of my head, the 5-cost Magellan. There's another card that's somewhat it could come up, there's a trigger I knew you can't even do that on your turn. Yeah, so it's pretty much a vanilla leader. At that point, if you want to go high roll, I recommend playing Kaido and just add in the 5-cost Magellan, because you can do that anyway. And I've literally played against people who don't even get to 10 Dawn because they're playing Magellan, and it screwed them. And you lose to green. If the guy's playing 8-drop, I was going against the guy in the 3v3 tournament. I sat there being super passive, and then I waited a second. I was like, wait, you can't play 10-drop Kaido because you're not Animal Kingdom. And I told him that. And then I put down 2 8-drop Kid back-to-back, and I just won. Like, it wasn't fair. So that's why I probably wouldn't play Magellan. Next honorable mention is Blue-Purple Kaido. If you are a crafty boy, you can top with this deck. This deck is actually so good. I would almost put this in tier 2, but I've never seen anyone play it. I've seen people play in Japan. I've messed around with it myself. So the evidence is somewhat anecdotal, but at face value, you have to think that, number one, when people are playing a wide variety of 1-drops and you can expect a lot of Zoro, you are going to perform amazing. And if less people played Whitebeard, I would say this is a viable tier 2 option, because the advantage is when the guy plays Makino, taps it, he plays Bonnie, he plays Momonosuke, he taps them, you're essentially getting to trigger your leader ability in the early game without having to expend a resource to do so, and it makes it to where you can compensate for not having stage, and you get access to blue, which blue is the least powerful color in the game, but it has some cards that are situationally powerful, and since we can compensate with a bunch of good purple cards, it really makes up for that. And that's why I think that this is a really good meta call if you expect to see a lot of Zoro, a lot of Kinemon, and not many Whitebeard. You're going to perform. You're going to go turn 2, if you're on the play, swing at their tapped searcher. They use a Makino. They're boosting up their Nami. You attack those with your leader, get that free value. It has synergy with the Impel Down engine. Overall, a really strong leader. Arguably could be on par with Kaido himself in the right tournament. Once again, I will reiterate that all of my evaluations are based on what I am expecting going forward in tournaments at different times in the meta. It is fair for you to move things around on your own, but for the most part, this is going to be the centralized list of decks that are viable at a competitive tournament. The last deck I will mention is Ivankov. Ivankov is another one of those decks where people will put it at the same level as Dofi. I just think you have a higher chance to brick to yourself, and you have to die going first. Going second with Dofi is tough, but it's not nearly as tough as going second with Ivankov, because you can still win with Dofi. And I think your leader ability works out better going into the late game. And what I've found with Ivankov is it's a viable deck and you can win, but losing the die roll hurts so much in this meta that it's almost an abysmal deck. You have to high roll, and even when you curve out, even when you go, yeah, turn 4 Ivankov playing another 7-drop, or playing a Croc or a Luffy, and you have the perfect sequence, it's still not that good if you open too many cards with no counter, because if the guy understands the matchup, he's going to keep punching you in the face, and you aren't going to be able to discard some of these cards, so he can just race you down because you're never triggering your leader ability, and at that point, you're using a vanilla leader. If you can't use your leader ability every turn, at that point, you might as well have just been using the same deck, but playing the blue crocodile leader, because that leader you could at least get value from when the guy is rushing you down. So that's going to be all for my competitively viable tier list. If you got this far in the video, thank you so much. I know this is a long one, but I had a lot of value to output today. Make sure to smash the like button, turn post notifications on, and make sure to enter the giveaway, and let me know what you want to see next from me, because I'm out here outputting the bangers. On this Saturday, if I get the video out in time, gonna be competing in the Carta Magica Online Regional. I'm going undefeated, baby. The best is blessed, and that's me. So invest in the best, and you will be blessed. You're about to see a performance like you've never seen before. I'm bringing my all-time best. I've been outworked before, and I don't like that feeling, so we're gonna take it to another level. I'm bringing a completely different deck this time. You can expect to see what you see right here, a transparent version of the best of all time. Goats come and go, but boats float. You know, and that's why I'm the best of all time. Thank you so much for watching. As always, if it's not the goo, it's got to go. Peace.
that indigo?